Okay. All right. Let's see if this is actually on. I was expecting a little bit more of a transition from Zoom, to be honest,
Yeah, I think we just got a
into
little toaster that
computing.
said webinar has started and then
The
recording. So
webinar has started. So,
I think
for
we're in a good
anybody
spot.
who's here already, welcome to our pipelines as more than just plumbing webinar. We'll get started in a minute. I just want to give a few more seconds for people to come in. And while they're trickling in, Brandon,
Yes,
we've talked about this
we
a little
have
bit,
for quite often.
but
Yes, a lot.
yeah, this is all we talk about. No, I want you, please map the big Sims to the fellowship, if you would, while we wait for
Ooh,
people to come in
ooh,
before
that's
we
a
start.
yeah. No, that's a great question. Okay, well, I don't think I can do all nine, so I'll probably like keep it to about five just for the sake of time. But if I had to map the different Sims of the Fellowship, I'd probably do Gandalf the Grey. Would probably be, kind of Splunk, right? I think everybody knows who Splunk is at this point. They know the name. Super powerful. It can be very expensive, right? And if you need to have Gandalf services, you're definitely gonna, probably pay a premium. I think Legolas, a man after my own heart, because he has luscious hair and I have none of that now. I've lost my hair at the crisp age of 19 several years ago. But I would say CrowdStrike would probably be Legolas, right? Started off in the endpoint spot, pretty pretty accurate, pretty yeah, I would say that's where they're at. Boromir would be Curator, kind of the, legacy powerhouse tool. It's heavy respected, but if you've ever seen Lord of the Rings, Boromir's kind of been like weighted down by his past, and I really think that's when I talk to folks who are on Curator, that's kind of what they're struggling with. I would say Saruman would be Arcsite. Old school. It's a great tool. A lot of our founders came from there. I actually got my start in the sim space leveraging ArcSight. It's known for many spells, but it can be very complex when you want to get to that level. And then I think just if people are going down the whole platform play, like they're doing this big consolidation, I kind of feel like that's really the one ring, right? Or you're getting kind of trapped in like this, hey, it'll be the promise of simplicity, but then, your architecture is now locked in. If you want to move away from that, you pretty much have to start all over again. But I will just kind of wrap up the fellowship comment is like I think it works though because in security, most security stacks are run well and work well when the tools work together. And I think each member of the fellowship does one thing well. And I think ultimately monolithic sims have traditionally fallen due to things like pipelines being able to swap pieces in and out as needed, and giving folks the ability to do that without added complexity. So yeah, long-winded answer, but
Okay.
I think that's my opinion.
No, that was really actually a lot more complex of an answer than I was expecting. Who is Liv Tyler though?
Yeah, true. Yeah.
What was
No
her
comment.
what Arwen? Okay, okay.
Arwen, yeah. Arwen, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, no. Well, I mean, maybe abstract's got to fit in there somewhere. So
Okay. All
yeah,
right,
maybe we'll
sick.
save that for the end.
All right. Let's get for real started. I
Yeah.
am Aurora Starita, product marketing at Abstract, and I am joined today with my ride or die number one best SE, no offense, Deets, Brandon
Woohoo.
Borodach. Brandon, please introduce
Yeah.
yourself and tell me about your unexpected journey.
Yeah, absolutely. So, hey, folks, my name is Brandon Borodach. I'm the Field CTO over here at Abstract. Been in the sim space about 15 years now. Like I kind of made the joke of mapping the different sim vendors to the fellowship. I've had exposure to pretty much every sim. I got my start in security working with DHS as a contractor for a local municipality sheriff's office in what's called a fusion center. The fusion centers are really a great way for information sharing engineering as it relates to pretty much any type of crime, but including in that crime is cybercrime. So I got my start kind of in cyber, working at one of those fusion centers. It was a ton of fun, but very quickly I realized how much I don't know working in kind of that Fed space and not really necessarily having access to a lot of the brand new tools. And so, I looked at moving potentially into the private sector. From there, went to work at an MSSP where I got exposure to all those different SIEMs, right? I was building out detection content. I was doing engineering work with them. And it was a ton of fun, right? I got exposure to a lot of different ways of how organizations can actually set up these different SIEM environments, how they work with them, how they deploy content. And then, that kind of led me to go from an MSSP and kind of settle on specific vendors. I really focused on Splunk for a while there, and then just wrapped up a 5.5 year stint at Sumo Logic as their field CTO in security, working with a few other great folks over there. So yeah, that's been my journey.
Okay. So you've been all across Middle Earth then.
I have, absolutely.
What are the problems that you see kind of time and time again that SOCs are having?
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, one of the things that I got nicknamed at Sumo was the Splunk Killer, for better or for worse, even though it helped me start my career. And not that I don't like Splunk at all, I love it; it's a great tool. Was the whole effort of migrations, right? And we've heard time and time again, the joke that. A certain company bought Splunk because their bill was too high, right? That's a joke that's been floated around. I've seen it on Reddit a couple of times, right? And that's a real thing. And I think CISOs and leadership have to make decisions for the company, and security kind of has to just follow along with that at times. And not, again, those decisions are made for better or for worse, but I think a lot of times they're done for cost. And unfortunately, that burden is then on the security team and the people that are underneath of like, how do we do this journey? How do we migrate this? And I think there's sometimes frustration because I've actually seen it where I was working with a large retail vendor that, had migrated to Splunk a year and a half, and then year and a half goes by, Splunk gets too expensive. Now they're looking at Sumo. And now I had to migrate them from Splunk to Sumo. And so it's the same problem, right? It's, well, hey, data, I need to migrate my data. Okay, well, then what comes with that data? Why do you even have the data? The data facilitates use cases, right? A lot of times in security, those use cases are detections. So then how do we take those detections? How do we migrate those now? Right. And so this conversation is always me going with the client and trying to reassure them time and time again, hey, don't worry about it. We'll make sure the data gets over. Hey, don't worry about it. We'll make sure your detection gets over. Meanwhile, my sales reps also working the angle of like, yeah, I'll throw in a bunch of PS for free. But then after that, here's a premium support bill you're going to have to do to maintain some of those detections. And I just feel like it's really this endless cycle that teams unfortunately have to go through. And I think that's one of the main reasons why I left my role at Sumo to come over to Abstract, because what we're doing in this space and really, what we're talking about here today is that there's a better way to do that. And I think that better way to do that is not, force customers into this, vendor lock-in, force them into like they have to build their detections time and time again when these migrations happen.
Right, because it sounds like, you know, my team has made this whole journey. Like we go through
Mm-hmm.
this whole journey of SIEM migration, and then how long do you even get to enjoy your SIEM
The fruits of your
like
labor.
before the fruits of your labor before you have to do it all over again?
Yeah, I mean, if you're lucky, at most 3 years, right? I mean, I think in my sales career, I think the longest deal I've seen happen was a 5 year deal. But it was a very, very large retailer, right? And the CISO even said, "Hey, the reason I'm doing this 5 year deal is because I don't want my team to have to swap tools again," because they had just got done doing that, right? Like almost every year at that point. So they did a 5 year lock in. And while that's great, right? When you say, "Hey, I'm going to lock a solution in for 5 years," like you're making a bet and you're taking a risk with that solution that they're going to continue to iterate. They're not going to get bought. They're not going to do things and shift their entire vision and go a different way. And I think, organizations should have the flexibility to kind of swap things out on the left hand side, swap things out on the right hand side, and not have to deal with, the chaos that comes with that. But yeah, I mean, on an average, I'm thinking, year contracts and maybe 3 year contracts. But then after the year's up, like if you're thinking about leaving, then you have to start doing your due diligence maybe 6 months before that contract's over. So I feel like it's this never ending cycle, right? That people are kind of locked into.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have the endless cycle.
Hmm.
It's just again and again and again.
Yeah.
What are you suggesting?
Yeah, so I mean, in the spirit of Lord of the Rings, which that's my background right now. It's a Hobbit hole. I'm a big Lord of the Rings nerd, and I think in security we should have fun with it. I think webinars should be fun. They shouldn't be boring. So, I as a Lord of the Rings fan, why don't they just take the Eagles to Mount Doom? And that's really what I'm trying to say here, right? Is let's take a shortcut. Why do we have to be a part of this cycle? Why can't we break free from this? And I think there's a lot of different pipeline tools that are out there. Most of them have either gone out of business now or they've been bought by other SIEM vendors. And if you think about why the other SIEM vendors are buying them, it's because it allows them to migrate data easily to their platform. And then again, the customer's now locked in at that point because it's that collection mechanism to get the data. But for us, right over here at Abstract, what we're doing is not only are we allowing you to migrate your data kind of through that security data pipelines or just pipelines in general, but also attaching detections up as a part of that migration. So if you were to essentially say, okay, hey, I have Splunk right now, maybe I'm looking at going to a Chronicle or I'm going to a Sentinel, that's fine. What we would basically approach to you is say, hey, why don't we take those detections, shift that left with your data pipeline tool as well. So now I have my data that's routable anywhere I want, and I have my detections that are routed right there as well. And an added benefit with Abstract is that those detections are now in real time. So it's streaming detections. And I think that's really an important differentiator. And I've, quite frankly, I've met some organizations that don't really care about, hey, I have a detection that runs every hour. I have some that say that's cool, but like why is real time important? And I do think there is a place for that, especially as it relates to the regulatory side. But more importantly, the team gets to stop paying the SIM tax where they have to consistently migrate these detections every time they swap. And you'll even notice that some of these MSSPs are trying to go down this path as well. But again, right, all those detections are locked in with that MSSP. When you leave and go to a different MSSP, then you got to have those detections recreated. But if you kind of shift that a little bit left, I think the big point on the slide here that's called out is that that investment stays with you. The time and the effort that your team poured into building that detection, to then tuning that detection, to then having test cases be built for that detection. Like all of that gets to stay the same now. And again, you can swap out the data lake or swap out whatever quote unquote SIM you have on the backside of this, and you don't have to redo that work again.
Yeah, absolutely. So when, we're looking at all of these, the problems that a migration
Yeah.
has and what a pipeline can do to make that easier. But,
Yeah.
a pipeline can do even more than that, right? There's so many
Yeah.
things. I mean, we talked about detections in stream already, but
Yeah.
can you speak a little bit more? And I know you already did, but on what you can do with real time. I know you said not everybody
Yeah.
cares, but
Yeah.
maybe they
Yeah.
should.
Yeah, they should. No, I definitely think they should, especially if they are in regulatory kind of verticals or they have kind of pressure from their legal teams of like, hey, we need to be notified of this as soon as it happens. It brings me back to a conversation of I had with one of our researchers. He's actually just got promoted, so shout out to him, who actually runs our entire threat research team, our integrations for the pipeline. He comes from a FinServ and a financial background. And one of the things that he was always worried about is, he has operating units in Japan, for instance, and Japan has a law that if you have a breach, you have an hour to report that to the authorities. And so if you have, a scheduled search or a search that's running and that takes 20 minutes to run because that's how you have to schedule it, well, now your time has 40 minutes left to gather your story, gather the artifacts, and get that data over to legal. But if you have something like Abstract where you have these detections in real time, and I don't want to cheat and get ahead of myself, but my next slide really kind of talks about the context and the enrichments that we can actually provide as well with that detection. Really what we're getting to is the mean time to respond for the analyst is much sooner now. And again, that's independent of whatever downstream technology you pick. But now instead of it being 15 to 20 minutes that you have to take to do all this, this is happening within seconds. The analyst needs to review it, maybe do a couple other queries to get some additional context, but then now they can go over to legal and say, hey, I got this here with 50 minutes to spare. Now let's strategize. How do we talk about this? How do we approach this? What data are we missing? What information are we missing in order to make a clean and crisp PR document, which, as a marketer, you're very familiar with PR documents. So
It's all I think about all day. Why don't you go ahead and cheat? Let's see that next
Hmm.
slide.
Awesome. Yeah. So, I kind of led the horse to water here, but I think one of the other things that people don't really realize about, a pipeline tool is a lot of the value can get left off the table as well if you're not enriching the data and moving those enrichments from your downstream solutions earlier in the process, right? Again, nothing wrong with doing lookups, nothing wrong with doing indexes and doing a bunch of joins, but like that can get complex. And then again, it's yet another thing you have to worry about when you go to migrate that from your solution A to solution B or what have you. And I don't like to read from slides, but you'll see on here on the left, right? There's this context problem. I think every analyst deals with this, where you get maybe a firewall log, or maybe you get an endpoint log, and you don't really necessarily have username attribution. You don't necessarily have other information. Is this asset vulnerable? You're missing a bunch of context. And again, I don't want to be bullish to some of the source solutions out there, but like SOAR was created because SIEM couldn't provide that value add that SOAR is providing, right? So another solution got set up to solve that. But I think it's more of a context problem, right? Because most of the time when I'm working with clients and they have a SOAR, really what their SOAR is doing is more of playbooks to gather additional enrichment, right? Gather additional context. Why not just do that earlier in the pipe? So now every detection you get is fully enriched, right? So I can have things like, hey, who does this asset actually belong to? So what's the user? What are some vulnerability information that's maybe associated to this? Or like you see here where it says like CMDB, and I don't want to get into that's probably a whole other webinar on like the CMDB rant, how it's up to date, is it up to date, right? But again, I think a lot of these highly regulated folks will have asset tagging, right? I think that asset tagging plays a big proponent of how you potentially even write your detections, right? Like if this is a machine that's in my ATM network, well, everything's probably critical coming from that to a certain extent, right? And I would probably put more credence on that versus, oh, Brandon got a phishing email, right? So again, the main point here is that this context can kind of stay with your data, stay with your detections, again, regardless of what's going on downstream, and your team doesn't actually have to build these out again.
So I know we're really focused on security here with
Hmm.
these particular slides, but it does seem like
Yeah.
there can be other use cases for this enrichment. And
Oh, yeah. Yeah, yeah,
yeah, so
absolutely, right. So, I mean, obviously, the talk here is focused on security. I'm a security guy, right? But as we have customers, right, that are bringing in application logs, right? That's not necessarily a security use case, right? Security might want to consume some of those application logs to do some level of detection, but those application logs are pretty much it. Look, honestly, if it can get logged to a flat file or streamed or sent via webhook, I can take it and we can provide additional context. I've had clients chain several enrichments together to kind of even build a log in abstract, right? Because their application doesn't provide good logging, but it provides pieces of things. And I can basically bring those pieces together to tell a coherent story. Again, just creating the log on the fly for them. So it's not necessarily locked to security. Obviously, the gist of the conversation today is security focused. But yes, absolutely, IT teams can take advantage of what we have going on here at Abstract.
okay, you heard Brandon. If you can log it, he can take
You
it.
can, yes, if you log it, I can take it. I can promise you that. And I think I,
So
I, I did. Oh, go ahead.
no, finish, complete.
Yeah, no, I was just
Complete
going to
that
say
thought.
this quote down here at the bottom. I was working with a prospect, and one of the things that they said and saw as a differentiator with us is, you get the sim rich data without the sim data costs. And I think that was a great quote, and that's why I stole it a little bit. And I was like, hey, this is a great quote. I want to use this now on every slide I can, because I think it's important, right? Because at the end of the day, we're trying to get as much value as we can while lowering your cost, right? And I think that's a great sticking point, at least for abstract, is that we're going to be able to provide you a lot of that rich context, a lot of the data that you're going to need and understand to make these decisions as a business. Is this data relevant or is it not relevant? Without having to pay, a premium to do so. And why would I not buy that if I'm on the other side of the table? And I do think I haven't talked about it yet, but like the leveling up the entire team. I mean, I I was chatting with a prospect yesterday who, has kind of been building everything internally, and they're debating on whether or not they want to go down the MSSP route. The only really reason why they would do that is like the tier one component of it, right? Where it's like, hey, is this going to be escalated? Is this worthy of escalation? But the main reason of, when I was chatting with them of like why they would even do that is they just don't have context, right? They have to go out and run these additional queries. They'd have to run a couple of playbooks to go interrogate Active Directory or Workday. And basically at the end of the conversation, we were talking with them, um, you know, they're going to move forward with us on a POV to actually have us do that enrichment, right? Like that's going to be the main use case for us is that, hey, can we take these disparate logs, enrich the data so they can determine from a detection layer, is this already tier two? And they basically skip tier one automatically, right? By just having more context and more information in the logs themselves. So
Sick. So
sick indeed.
I guess, yeah. So we talked about this whole journey, the migration aspects. Our
Hmm.
detections are solid. When you have this whole detections in the pipeline situation, but I guess, how does it all fit together for security?
Yeah. Yeah, great question. This is one of my last slides, and the last slide will be a very specific, kind of abstract how we get in here. But I think this is the return of the king, right? And I like to say that because we've kind of gone down this journey, and we're kind of coming to a close of like, why does this matter? How do we make this actionable, right, for our prospects, the folks who are on the web and are now who kind of came to see what we're really trying to solve here? And I think ultimately, right, the vision and the goal is how can we get what's critical sent downstream or alerted on in the pipeline to allow clients to really just focus on the things that are actionable and then have everything else be useful for an enrichment perspective, or investigations as supplementary data without you having to pay premium costs for that supplementary data. Unfortunately, we're in a world where compliance runs everything for better for worse. And I've talked to clients that have to keep data for 7 years, for 5 years, right? And a lot of it's not mission critical. A lot of it's not, useful for detecting an adversary, but they have to keep it. And so giving customers an option to potentially route that, high volume, low fidelity data off to a cheaper storage, also enriching it, but then alerting on some of these kind of critical components, I think is great. I also mentioned AI on this slide. So, I mean, obviously we're in 2026. I've talked for about 20 minutes and haven't mentioned AI yet. So I'm proud of myself. The AI talk is now here, um, which is, AI is honestly how SIEMs used to be, right? Garbage in, garbage out. If I feed it a bunch of garbage, how is it going to ever be able to predict, ever be able to provide you a good analysis or even a good outcome of what's going on within the environment, right? And so, one of the main reasons that we've been doing this is I can have this detection be sent. I can have this fully enriched log. The detection's enriched now. The log's fully enriched. So now the AI gets to consume that data. It's cleaned. It's structured. It gives it exactly what it needs. But let's say it still needs to ask another question. Well, then it will have connections, right, to your data lake. It will have connections to wherever that lower fidelity data is, and be able to, to run those queries. And again, you're not having to pay a premium for that. I think, if I were to kind of summarize uh, what we've been talking about, I think ultimately, right, it's security is changing. It's changing fast. AI has proved that. But I think there's some fundamental things that we can do without just layering in AI over everything, right? You use it for the tools that it's, or the use cases that it's great for, but seeing that there's a better way to do that, right? And the pipeline space, grew pretty quickly, right? When I was at, Sumo, I just started at Sumo. The pipeline space really started to kind of come alive, and I started to see it, and I started to see, the value that organizations would get from that, being able to migrate data wherever they want. They don't have this kind of vendor lock-in from a collection. They can do things like drag and drop, and that's great. I just think over here at Abstract, what we're really doing is trying to say, hey, that obviously still has its value, but now we can do that with detections and shift those detections left. And then, a customer can basically survive anytime one of the big three come and say, hey, migrate everything to us and we'll give it to you for free. And then security's like, what? Now what do I do? I got to go and recreate all this. I just did that. I just spent, the last 2 years of my career fine tuning all these detections. And now you're telling me I got to go redo all that. And, I don't think that's, I don't think we have to do that anymore. I don't think security teams have to deal with that. And I think, ultimately the quote says it, right? I don't think pipelines are just plumbing anymore. I think they can actually become the control plane. I call out specifically security data here, but just in general, I think it can become the control plane for your data. So,
Right. And then that would bring security into this is something that you talk about a lot, being
Mhm.
an enabler rather
Yeah,
than,
absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah,
Huh.
rather than a cost center. I mean, I remember doing a panel, and I got thrown a really hardball question of like, "Hey, why is security always a cost center?" Well, it's a great question, right? Why is security always a cost center? And I think partially it's because we've always been, consumers of the data, and we've always had this mindset of like, we're always going back to IT. We're always knocking on the door saying, "Hey, I need this data now to do this detection. Hey, I need this to do that detection." But I mean, quite frankly, if security had the option with a tool like Abstract to kind of own the pipeline aspect of this and the detections, they're much closer to that. Now they don't really need to keep knocking on IT's door to continuously get more and more information. They already know what detections they need to build. They can control that right there within the pipeline tool and route everything else to a lower cost storage. So I do think it kind of shifts the table a little bit. That allows security to kind of help make those decisions and also be in the driver's seat to helping reduce costs for the organization without missing visibility or missing potential detections.
I think that might be another webinar, perhaps,
Yeah,
perchance.
I'm all for it. Yeah, I'm all for it.
So I think, unless you have any final thoughts, I mean, we actually do have a question, and I also want to invite
Yeah,
anybody. Oh, yeah, we
yeah, I
do
do
have
have.
one
I'll
more
just pull this
thing.
up, and then we can. I can quickly walk through this again. I really appreciate everybody joining the webinar today. I'll just kind of highlight this, and then we can get to the Q&A and some other questions that folks have.
Yeah, so we'll take
So
questions about this or about Lord of the Rings because Brandon knows a lot
correct.
about both. So,
Correct.
all right,
This is
continue.
correct. Yeah, yeah. So, I love this quote. Not all those who wander are lost. I think in security, we've always tried to play it safe. Actually, shout out to you, Aurora. Didn't you just release a newsletter today on that about like people playing it safe a little bit? Okay, yeah.
May have done.
Um,
May have done.
so check that out. No, but I think security has always kind of played it safe, and there's kind of two camps, right? The early adopters that are okay with a little bit of risk and okay with doing things a little bit differently, or kind of those traditional folks that are like, hey, no one gets fired for buying a tool. I'll just leave it at that. Again, I think it's okay to wander a little bit. I think it's okay to look at this through a different lens. And again, I just wanted to show one example, right, of how Abstract can integrate with something that I've been seeing trending really heavily here recently with a lot of the different prospects, both small and large organizations, where they're really kind of going down this path of kind of rethinking what SIM is to them, right? And SIM in the past has been a place where I can aggregate my data, I can do detections, and I can search it, and that's great. But again, you're kind of relying on one tool to do all of those things, and there are it's funny because in security, and sorry for this side rant, but like everything security besides the SIM is you buy the best of breed solution to do it. Right? You buy a best of breed email gateway tool, you buy a best of breed endpoint tool. But then this whole like platformatization thing came around as like, hey, just all in your eggs in this one basket and we'll help lower the costs. And I think, with how fast technology is changing, there's a better way to do that where you can get these best of breed solutions as it relates to data, to searching, to some of the more triage based things, right? And so that's what you're seeing here on the screen is I have all my different data sources here that are coming in on the left hand side. They make it into Abstract at this point. I can normalize that data, which we do by default. The benefit there, right, is now that becomes in a normalized field. I can search that data almost immediately. One of the things that we've been seeing a lot from prospects is some of the new SaaS apps, things like Workday, Salesforce, and pretty much any SaaS app that gets spun up nowadays. Right, it's pretty challenging to collect, and we pride ourselves on being able to collect that data very quickly. But again, once we do collect that data, it's actionable immediately. We've already normalized that data, and in fact, if you already have enrichment set up in the platform with things like asset and identity information or threat intel feeds, that data is already enriched. It's just you bring the data in. I've normalized it already. Now I'm doing all that enrichment. So, time to value is minutes once I actually get the right guy on the call or gal on the call, and I can do that integration. From there, again, you're seeing here the kind of streaming detection. So I can detect that information. I can correlate. One of the things I want to call out is when I say detection, I truly mean detections. I've been building detections, like I said, for the majority of my career in these different SIEMs. So doing use cases where I'm cross correlating between sources, right? So like a proof point event, and then maybe I want to see if that user clicked on the link and then did my network proxy actually allow the traffic outbound. That's cross correlating two different sources. Again, I can do that in stream independent of whatever downstream data lake you have. I can do a combination blocks, right? I can do say, hey, this plus this is C. Okay, well, C plus A is now B. Again, my head gets wrecked trying to think about all the different combinations that I can actually do with building detections, right? So you're able to do that within the platform. And then from there, right, I can just dump this to whatever data lake or whatever search platform that you prefer. And so, I've had a lot of folks come to me and say, "Hey, IT bought Databricks. Security is being kind of forced to go on the Databricks side or the Snowflake side. How do I make this operational? How do I work with this?" And we're helping solve that problem as well. But I think you'll see down here on the bottom, right, this whole thing of AI SOC that's coming out, and that's why I really mentioned the whole triage comment of garbage in, garbage out with these triage tools is that if you're not giving it good contextual rich data, you're going to be sitting there burning tokens, burning money, trying for have it go do that when you could have already done that and given the data or given it clean data so it could make its determination. And again, this is just one of the operating models, right? If you're interested in kind of how abstract might be able to fit in your architecture, obviously please reach out. Not an issue for us to kind of walk through that. Just wanted to kind of show an example that was kind of tailored to the talk that we had done today. So yeah,
Yeah,
I'll
this is
I'll pause there and I'll jump
ready.
to my Tolkien quote and then we can do some questions.
Okay. So, all right. Here are, okay, we have two questions. The first one is, has Aurora never seen Lord of the Rings? Yes, I've seen Lord of the Rings. What do you mean? Have I seen it recently? No, absolutely not.
I mean,
Uh,
I think that was Chris that asked the question. I think the better question is, has she seen the extended edition of Lord of the Rings? Because if she hasn't, then I think the answer is no, you haven't seen Lord of the Rings.
yeah, potentially. That's okay. I can live with that actually. And the next question is, are compute resource requirements higher than traditional pipeline solutions since the detections are shifted left? Can it handle tens of thousands of Windows event sources and get those events to SIEM in near real time, for example, or FW firewall logs, etc., large volume log sources?
Yeah, so I think inevitably there will be a little bit of a higher compute because we are shifting the detections left. The way that we've architected our platform, you're able to see that if you deploy it in your environment, or if it's a SaaS-based solution, you don't really have to worry about it. One of the things that I'll answer on the latter part of that, can handle tens of thousands of events. Absolutely, because we are a pipeline tool. If you're doing anything like dropping specific keys, dropping specific events, so meaning you don't want to look at 46, 62 events from a Windows domain controller when everything is touched. It generates millions of logs a day. You route that to your cold storage, but since I'm dropping that, the rules engine doesn't even see that data, so it's not actually computing or processing that high level data there. So you can actually control what data goes into the rules engine of what's actually being applied. So let's say you want to do those drop specific keys, do any type of aggregation or deduping. That happens before the rules engine, before it leaves our platform and goes to your um, downstream SIEM. So
All right. Well, that's all the questions that we got. But if you have any other questions, you can absolutely reach out to us, either me or Brandon on LinkedIn, or, come to the Abstract webpage. So I want to thank everybody for coming. And let's see, each Lord of the Rings is 3 hours long, right?
the extended editions sometimes go to 4, but yeah.
Okay. So if you've
Yeah.
got, 10 hours, if you got, 10 to 12
Oh, it's
hours,
bucket at 12, bathroom breaks, food breaks. Yeah.
we encourage you to do that. So, all right, everybody. Thank you. Take care, and we'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye bye.